Hello, Johann. How are you?
Really good. How you doing?
I'm great. My name is Laszlo Slim is here, and Johann Hari is. You are a writer and journalist, and you wrote a book called "Chasing the Scream: The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs." Is that right?
That's me.
All right.
So
And
first and foremost, I just got to say I'm really excited to have you on the show because I saw you on Bill Maher a couple weeks ago, and I read a lot of nonfiction, so I download the samples of books to my Kindle, and then if I like it, I'll buy it. And I saw your interview with Bill Maher, and I thought, all right, I'm going to check this out. I've been telling everyone on Twitter and friends that I know that like to read, this book is so good. The amount of time and research that went into this. I mean, you decided, 6 or 7 years ago, I'm going to look into the war on drugs, where it started, how it started, why it started, and where we are today, and what we can do to make things better. And I had my own, opinions and views about the war on drugs, and I was all for trying to find a way to decriminalize certain drugs. And by the time I finished your book, I'm telling my friend here that I think the government should give heroin to addicts. I mean, that's how compelling and thought provoking this book was. I thought it was great.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate you saying that. If you want to just follow me around and say that 3 times a day and whisper it into my ear, that would be perfect.
Well, okay, so obviously I recommend people read the book. Again, it's called Chasing the Scream, and you can get it anywhere. But we have a limited amount of time here, so I spent days reading your book. I need you to convince my friend here that the government giving people heroin, in the end, might be the best thing to do.
because here's, I'll give you my, and then I'd love to hear your take. But obviously, you're the expert. But my kind of feeling on this is, I'm a liberal guy. I think legalize drugs. I'm fine with that. There's no reason to criminalize them. Obviously, we have a prison problem in this country. All of these things make sense to me. I'm totally on board with you. Except for the fact that I don't understand why, if you want heroin, why the government has to buy it. Why can't you just buy it yourself?
Well, this is a really minor aspect of the book. So
It's a
4
totally
years
fine.
ago-
I feel bad. I'm like, hey,
You-
tell my friend.
Sure.
I know, but I'm trying to explain like how convincing this book was, and things that I never thought. It's like when you sat down with Bill Maher looked at you and said, these sound like great ideas, but it's never going to happen. And I kind of thought the same thing. And then I read the book and thought, no, actually these things could happen if we were informed.
Well, the important thing to understand is they have happened. They have happened in lots of places. 4 years ago, when I started working on this book, I had a very personal reason to want to understand this. We had addiction in my family. One of the earliest memories I have is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And obviously, as I got older, understanding why. And I thought of myself as a fairly well-informed person. But I realized we were coming up to 100 years since drugs were first banned. And I kind of began to see that there were loads of really basic questions about this whole area that I didn't know the answer to. Why did we criminalize drug users and drug addicts in the first place? Why do we continue with that strategy when lots of people think it doesn't work? What do the alternatives really look like? And what really causes drug use and drug addiction? So as you say, I went on this big, long journey. I went across 9 countries. I think part of the problem with this whole debate is we talk about it in an abstract way, as if we're in like some kind of philosophy seminar. I wanted to talk about real people and real people's lives. And one of the things I discovered is almost everything we think we know about this subject is wrong. Drug use is not what we think it is. Addiction is not what we think it is. The drug war is not what we've been told it is for 100 years. And the alternatives aren't what we think they are. So it covers a really broad range of things, as you say. You've gone to one of the chapters towards the end, which looks at what we do about heroin. And I think there's a broad range of things you do about heroin addiction. But again, we shouldn't talk about this abstractly. Let's talk about a real place that decided to do something differently. Switzerland is a very conservative country. I'm a Swiss citizen as well as a British citizen. My Swiss relatives made Michelle Bachmann look like Bernie Sanders, right? They are
Right.
not liberals.
Right.
And yet Swiss people have twice voted by very large majorities to provide heroin legally to addicts. The reason is, basically what they saw is the drug war means anarchy. It means unknown criminals selling unknown chemicals to unknown users, all in the dark, right? And that brought all sorts of problems, disease, criminality, addicts robbing people, all of that. So they decided to adopt a different strategy. What they decided to do is to go back to what used to happen in the United States before the drug war. If you were a heroin addict, you go to your doctor, the doctor refers you to a clinic, you go to that clinic, and they will give you the heroin there. Now, it's a legitimate debate, and I know this is a charged debate in America about whether they should pay for it or not. Park that argument for a minute. In Switzerland, they give it to them free, but you could charge a small amount, because actually heroin, when it's not controlled by criminals, is relatively cheap. So I don't get hung up on whether it's free or not. They can pay a small amount if they got it right. That's fine. The results have been really striking. So you're given the heroin, you're given for as long as you want, right? They'll never cut you off. They'll never throw you off the program. But what's fascinating is once they have access to a legal supply that is not the grossly inflated price that you get from the drug war, the vast majority of addicts get jobs, they get their lives together, they get homes, they go back to being productive members of society, and they choose. Remember, there's no pressure to cut back. Almost all of them choose over time to cut back their heroin use until they stop altogether. And that, to me, is really fascinating, because what we have at the moment, and have had for 100 years, is an approach to addiction that believes that if we take addicts who are suffering and make them suffer more, they'll stop. I went out in Arizona on a chain gang with women who were forced to wear T-shirts saying, I was a drug addict.
That chapter, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, Johann, but that that was the hardest chapter of your book for me to read. I was embarrassed that this happens in my country, and I know that it happens. I know we hear about him on TV, and we know that. But when I read in your book,
Sheriff Joe, whatever.
Yes, with the the chain gangs, and they've got women out there on these chain gangs. Most of them are there for drug crimes. And they're not being fed. They're forced. It's, we always hear about North Korea, and if you screw up, you got to go work in an internment camp. And in my mind, I'm thinking, really, what's the difference here? We've got people who are dying in solitary confinement, and no one's being held accountable for this. And they're just saying, well, they're drug addicts. They're not really worth anything anyway. So I'm not going to talk about it on the news at night.
I think you're totally right that what we've seen for 100 years is the dehumanization of drug addicts. And one of the ways that I tell that story is through the story of Billie Holiday, and how Billie Holiday was stalked and killed by the man who launched the war on drugs, Harry Anslinger. To me, it's such a fascinating story. In 1939, not far from where I am now in New York City, Billie Holiday stood on stage and she sang the song Strange Fruit, which is a song against lynching. And that night, she was ordered by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics to stop singing that song. And it was the narcotics department was run by this crazy racist called Harry Anslinger, who's probably the most influential person who no one's ever heard of. He invented the modern drug war. And when Billie Holiday refused to stop singing her song, he had her stalked and destroyed. He had her sent to prison. He had her denied a license to sing anywhere. He took away the ability of Billie Holiday to sing. Of course, this is what we do to addicts all over the world. Those women I met on that chain gang, they're never going to work again in the legal economy. We take away the things they love. We cut them off. And we think that somehow that will make them get their lives together. Of course, it has the opposite effect. When Billie Holiday collapsed here in New York with liver cancer, they arrested her on her deathbed. They handcuffed her to her deathbed. They didn't let her friends in to see her. The story of what was done to Billie Holiday is the story of what we do to addicts all over the United States. And there is another way. The other place that I think is really striking and really important for people to know about is Portugal. In the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin. It was terrible. And every year they tried the American way more and more. They arrested more people. They imprisoned more people. And every year the problem got worse. So one day, the leading politicians got together and said, look, we've got to do something about this. And they set up a panel of scientists and doctors to figure out what would genuinely solve the problem. And the panel came back and it said, decriminalize everything, from cannabis to crack. But, and this is the absolutely crucial next step, take all the money we currently spend on arresting drug users, imprisoning drug users, trying drug users, and spend all that money on doing the exact opposite of the American model, reconnect them with society. So the biggest elements of it were, partly it was things like rehab, and that has value, but mainly it was about getting addicts jobs and giving them loans in order to set up small businesses, very low-interest loans. So say you used to be a mechanic, your life fell apart. When you're ready, they'll go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy as a mechanic, we will pay half his wages for a year, right?
Right.
Because it saves so much money if he's not committing crime, if he's not being sent to prison, all of that stuff. And it's 14 years since Portugal tried this experiment, and the results are in. Injecting drug use is down by 50%, 50%. Every study shows across the board addiction is down Overdose is massively down. HIV is massively down. And one of the ways you know it's worked so well is I went to interview a guy called João Figueira, who's the top drug cop in Portugal. He led the opposition to the decriminalisation. And he said a lot of the things that a lot of your listeners will totally reasonably be thinking. Surely if you decriminalise all drugs, you'll have a massive increase in drug use. And he said to me, everything I said would happen didn't happen.
Right.
And everything the other side said would happen did. And he talks about how he hopes the whole world follows Portugal's example because it's worked so well.
That doesn't happen very often that you have. Again, we're talking to Johann Hari. He wrote Chasing the Scream, the first and last days of the war on drugs. And when I read that part, and you're talking about this conservative who was vehemently against the decriminalization of these drugs, to have him today say, you know what, I was wrong and you were right, it just doesn't happen over here very much. And when I read about Harry Anslinger, who you credit with being the founder of the modern day war on drugs, it reminds me a little bit of trickle down economics, right? It hasn't worked, it's never worked, and yet you've still got half the population, at least if not more, saying it's the only way that things can possibly be. It's the only way. It makes too much sense to do it any other way, even though the facts disagree.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. And there's a story in the book I tell of an incredible person called Lee Maddox, who was a cop in Baltimore. I think you're totally right that it's the people who believed in the drug war and saw the flaws in it who are the most important people to listen to. Lee signed up to be a cop in Baltimore because her best friend was murdered by what she believed was a drug gang. She went into this to destroy the drug gangs. That was her sole driving motive. And for 20 years, she was a vehement drug warrior. But Lee Maddox is an honest person, and she noticed something. When you're a cop and you arrest a rapist, the next week there's less rape in your town. If you're a cop and you arrest a dealer, well, there's no less dealing, right? No one thinks there isn't someone else on the corner. But more importantly, she noticed the murder rate actually goes up. She tried to investigate this, and basically the way it works is, I try to explain it, is if you and me go into a liquor store and we try to steal the beer or the vodka or whatever, they call the cops, and we'll be taken away. That liquor store doesn't need to be violent, doesn't need to be intimidating. If we go up to a local weed dealer or your local coke dealer and we try to steal what they've got, they obviously can't call the cops. The cops will arrest them. They have to be violent and intimidating, and they establish control of their area through violence and aggression that otherwise wouldn't happen. And obviously, if you then go and arrest them, you just trigger a war for control of their patch. The war on drugs creates a war for drugs. And so a huge amount of this violence that we see that is sometimes described as related to drugs, it's got nothing to do with drugs. These aren't people who are getting high and attacking each other. This is the nature of what happens when you ban something. If you banned milk and people still wanted to drink milk, then the people didn't have recourse to the law to protect their milk. They would fight each other and kill each other and establish a reputation of being terrifying.
Well, I use this, not to interrupt you, but I use that example all the time when we talk about it. The truth of the matter is, when's the last time you saw a guy shoot another guy for a pack of Marlboros?
Yeah, where are the violent alcohol dealers?
Yeah, it just doesn't happen.
Al Capone was there. The liquor aisle in Walmart doesn't go and blow up the local liquor store. But if it was prohibited, that's exactly what happened. This violence is the result of prohibition, not the result of drugs.
Something that I had never thought about, and you discussed in your book, is that, and I don't even remember which country we were talking about at this point, but you had people who said, okay, if we decriminalize drug use is going to increase a lot. And then you had the proponents say, no, we think we can keep it steady. But what ended up happening was drug use went down, and everyone said, well, okay, we've decriminalized drugs. Why would the drug use go down? And the answer is, if you're an addict and you have to go buy heroin from someone at the park, in order to make money to feed that addiction, you need other people to buy drugs from you as well. And you called drugs the ultimate pyramid scheme, because if I'm an addict, I need to go convince the kid at the playground to buy some drugs for me so he can help pay for my addiction. And when you legalize it, I don't have to convince that kid to do drugs anymore. I can do them wherever I want.
Yeah, that's a really smart way of putting it. That happened in Liverpool and England when they prescribed heroin. Exactly, that you saw a significant fall in new heroin addicts. So it goes back to what we talked about earlier. What one of you said earlier about why should we pay for this? There's a total debate about, some people just think you can get the addict to pay. But the important thing is it actually saves loads of money, because you see a massive fall in street crime, prostitution, theft, burglary. I think the figure in Switzerland, it's in the book, the figure when they started prescribing heroin was a 93% fall in burglary. Like, you're talking about an enormous fall. It costs a little bit of money to prescribe the drug, but it saves an absolute fortune.
And that's how we can win over conservatives in this country, right? To just remind everybody, because you've got liberals who are already saying it doesn't work, and you've got some conservatives on the libertarian wing there that say it's stupid and we shouldn't do it, and we can sell this, if nothing else, as a cost-saving measure and a crime decreaser.
Exactly. I think actually liberty-based arguments about ending the war on drugs, although I have some sympathy for them, are extremely unpopular. If you look at the countries that have moved beyond the war on drugs, and everywhere that moves beyond the war on drugs never regrets it and never goes back, the arguments that prevail are generally not the ones about people should be free to do what they want with their own bodies. They're overwhelmingly, and they're equally true ones, saying we need to reclaim this enormous industry from armed criminal gangs.
Right.
We need to bankrupt those armed criminal gangs. That's essential. And we need to transfer this to where it used to be in the United States, in the hands of doctors and pharmacists. You know, would you rather that this industry was controlled by the Crips and the Bloods and the Zetas and the Gulf Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel, or by CVS and your local family doctor?
Right.
That's the choice we have.
Well, at this point in the world, I'm not exactly sure which one's more on the up and up, but that's a different discussion. But you know, one of the things that I think about when I you know, I don't know when it was, but it's Nixon. We can all hear him saying the war on drugs is public enemy number one, or however he put it. And so people kind of followed that without thinking about it. And like you said, we talk about it in the abstract, but what we're really talking about is like what we talk about with censorship and other big issues that are philosophical debates. Even though you say this one shouldn't be, is that people who think about the legalization of drugs, what they think about is not that they will then do heroin. It's that everyone else will do heroin or their kids will do heroin, which is the same thing as why we have censorship. I can handle this, but I don't think kids or other people should be allowed to see this. This is the same thing with the war on drugs, right?
I think that's really important. Say to me in a minute about kids, but I think there's something we need to really understand about this, and this is something I had no idea about when I started doing the research for the book. I thought that drug addiction was caused by the drug, right? If you'd said to me 4 years ago, what causes heroin addiction, I would have looked at you like you were a little bit stupid, and I would have said, well, heroin causes heroin addiction. We have a story about addiction that we've been told for 100 years that's become our common sense. We think if you, me, and the next 20 listeners to this show all used heroin together, because there are chemical hooks in heroin, our body would physically need the heroin, and that's what addiction is, right? The first thing that made me aware that there may be a problem with that story is when it was explained to me, if you or me, after this interview, get hit by a car in the street and we break our hip, we'll be taken to hospital and we'll be given a lot of diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's medically pure heroin. It's much stronger heroin than you buy on the streets because it's not adulterated by dealers. You'll be given it for quite a long period of time, quite likely. Anyone listening to this, there's a hospital near you where loads of people are being given heroin a lot of the time. If what we think about addiction is right, those people, when they leave hospital, should be addicts. You would have noticed that virtually never happens. Your grandmother was not turned into a junkie by her hip replacement, right?
Right.
So I didn't really know what to do with that when I read that. And then until I met a guy called Bruce Alexander, an incredible man who's a professor in Vancouver, who explained to me the idea of addiction we have comes from a series of experiments. It was done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. People listening to this at home could do it themselves if they're feeling a bit sadistic. You get a rat and you put it in a cage and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water and one is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drug water and almost always kill itself by overdosing quite quickly. So there you go. That's our theory of addiction. But what Bruce explained is in the 70s, he came along and said, hang on a minute. The rat's in an empty cage. It's got nothing else to do. Let's do this differently. So Bruce built Rat Park. Rat Park is like heaven for rats. They've got loads of coloured balls. They've got loads of cheese. They've got loads of friends. They can have loads of sex. Anything a rat wants, it's got. And it's got both the water bottles, the drugged water and the normal water. But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They hardly ever drink it. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. There's a human example of this that I can talk about too. But what Bruce says is he shows that both the right-wing and left-wing theories of addiction are wrong. The right-wing theory of addiction is, it's a moral failing, you're a hedonist, you party too hard. The left-wing theory is your brain gets hijacked, it's a disease. Bruce says it's not your morality, it's not your brain, it's your cage. Addiction is largely an adaptation to the environment you live in. If you think about that, you and me, right, set aside the drug laws for a second. Of 3, we could all be drunk now, right? I'm drinking Diet Coke here. I could be drinking vodka. You could all be drunk, right? We're not. Because
I am.
We've got
Yeah.
something. Okay, you are, but the other
Just so you know.
two aren't. And the reason why we're not drunk is because we've got something we want to be present for in our lives.
That's right.
We've got jobs we love. We've got things we want to be present for. It's not like if you came up to me now and offered me legal heroin, I wouldn't go, oh, great. I'd be like, well, I've got stuff to do. I don't want this. I don't like the idea of it.
Right.
So it's really important to understand that addiction is driven by isolation, disconnection, and pain. And we have a system that is built on the idea that we should take addicts and make them more isolated, more disconnected, and inflict more pain on them.
Right.
in the
Let's
belief
take
will
that
make
rat
them
out of
stop.
his cage that just overdosed in his little solitary confinement cage. We'll put him in another cage where he can't get to his drugs. And then as soon as we let him out, we'll put him back in the cage with the drugs. You know, it's
Exactly.
a silly cycle, and I really hope everyone will read the book. It's called Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs. And I use Rat Park now as a metaphor, and I need other people to read the book so they'll know what I'm talking about. Johann Hari, honestly, one of the best books I've read in a really long time. I hope people will buy it. And thanks for calling in.
Oh, I'm so thrilled. Thank you so much for reading it so
You're a
quickly.
real
I'm
journalist.
really
I mean, you are a real journalist. You didn't just say, you know what? I'm curious how my family got addicted. I'm going to look this all up on the internet and write a book. You traveled the world and spent years meeting people, shaking hands, and learning about this, and it's impressive. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really thrilled by that. Thanks.
All right, have a great day.
You too. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.